Well, good evening, P Street family. Whoever else is joining us that has been listening in to these lessons here on Sunday nights. We are studying the book of Jonah as best we can. And if you're kind of visiting with us, that's sort of in quotation marks. We're glad to have you here. And then I realize that some of you may watch the recording either on YouTube or Facebook. And as always, I hope that what we discuss is helpful to you, is educational, and challenging to some extent. So this is what we're in the middle of doing. We're kind of doing a chapter by chapter study. I'm breaking Jonah into 4 Sunday nights. There's 4 chapters in Jonah. We are getting the whole text in front of us. As you can see, the subtitle is Peeve Preacher, Gracious God. And that first part doesn't really come to a head until the final chapter. We discussed before I get there, here's the overview. So Jonah 2 tonight, Jonah 3 next Sunday night, and then Christmas is falling on a Friday this year. So 2 days after that, we will cover Jonah chapter 4. Here's what I called chapter 1 is the unexpected reluctance of a commissioned prophet. God told Jonah, his prophet, to go to Nineveh and preach to the people there. In response, Jonah did the complete opposite. He didn't go towards Nineveh. If he was supposed to go east towards Nineveh, he decided to go west towards Tarshish, which was as far away from Nineveh as he could possibly get, is the picture we're supposed to get of his reaction. And as we discussed, Jonah was setting off on a impossible anti-quest. There's no way you can hide from God. There's no way you can run from God. But for some undisclosed reason here in the first chapter, Jonah is not interested in obeying God. And so he ends up being thrown overboard. He ends up being cast into the sea. And we're left at the end of chapter 1 wondering, will Jonah drown at sea? And I made the argument that God could have just left him there. He could have. But in Jonah 1:17, we learn that God has mercy on Jonah. And I mentioned at the end of the lesson last Sunday night that I think 1:17 should be the first verse in chapter 2. In fact, that's how the Hebrew Bible has it. But our English chapter verse divisions, this is arguably an unfortunate, situation, putting 1:17 at the end of chapter 1. I think it's better to be in chapter 2. So that's why I kind of ended our thoughts with Jonah just basically out to sea. What's going to happen to him. And here we have in Jonah chapter 2 the unexpected rescue by a gigantic fish. So God has mercy on Jonah, and he rescues Jonah in an unexpected, surprising way. If you were a first-time reader of the story of Jonah, how could you have guessed that Jonah would have been swallowed by a big fish? Now, arguably, this picture here, I'll blow it up for you. It's a cool picture. I doubt the fish was so big that Jonah would have had this much room in the belly of this fish. My guess is he might have been in pretty tight quarters. That depends on the relative size of the fish, but you get the point. And here is our passage. Jonah 1:17 says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." So obviously God had further use of Jonah, so he made provision for the preservation of Jonah's life. Now you'll notice the text says the Lord appointed a great fish. He didn't create one. A fish did not materialize out of thin air. Okay, it wasn't like, or the ocean. It wasn't like, boom, here's the fish. It's evidently this fish had been appointed, designated, determined by God to go and swallow Jonah. The fish could have been one of several sea creatures capable of swallowing a man. Most of us, as our picture, our background depicts it, most people just sort of think in terms of a whale, because that's a big fish, right? And it might very well have been some species of whale. That's a very good possibility. But we leave the door open because all the text says is that it was a great fish that swallowed Jonah. The miracle, there's a miracle in this. The miracle, it isn't that Jonah was swallowed by a fish. It's that more than likely the miracle is that Jonah survived it. And we'll talk some more about that in a subsequent lesson. And before we bring this lesson to a close tonight, or on this installment here, we will discuss that second sentence here in Jonah 1 and verse 17. So the way I want to break down chapter 2 is to provide you with an overview of the four purposes of the great fish. I see four purposes. The first one is the obvious one. The great fish saved Jonah's life. Now, I've often wondered if Jonah knew that immediately. Here he is sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And the next thing you know, he's being swallowed by a humongous fish. And so I often picture Jonah, sort of as he's being swallowed or engulfed by this fish, he might have thought, great. Rather than dying by drowning, I am going to die by digestion. Maybe something like that crossed his mind. We know that he soon realized that this fish was how God chose to save him from the water. So the first purpose this fish served was to save Jonah's life. The second purpose is the great fish provided a classroom of sorts for Jonah's spiritual education. If I were to end up in the belly of a fish, or if you were to end up in the belly of a fish, I think that we would immediately begin questioning our actions and our decisions that led us up to that point, right? If you would be thinking, man, how did I get here? Well, here's how I got here. I did this, I did that. Jonah most definitely is recounting what brought him to this point, that he is, first of all, in the ocean, second of all, that he's been swallowed by a fish. And the text at this point moves from prose or narrative in chapter 1, and it gets pretty quickly in chapter 2 to poetry. In fact, Jonah 2 takes the form of an individual psalm of thanksgiving. And that type of psalm is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the book of Psalms. And it does appear as if Jonah was aware of this portion of Scripture, that he was familiar with that portion of Scripture. And even, although we won't go into this in much detail, even some of the language that Jonah uses in this in chapter 2 here is reflected in the Psalms, in various Psalms, pieces of Psalms here and there. There is discussion about did Jonah speak in a psalm like this from the belly of the fish, or maybe after the fact he took sort of his thoughts that he had in the belly of the fish and put it in the form that we have it here in the book of Jonah. And that does raise that question about, well, who wrote the book of Jonah? And we're gonna come back to that at the very end of this of our discussion here in a couple of weeks. But nevertheless, this psalm of thanksgiving, I think, reflects, Jonah's gratitude for the Lord's deliverance and the Lord's salvation. And what I'm going to share with you here in the following slides is sort of my own arrangement of the English translation of Jonah's Psalm of Thanksgiving. So you can you'll see some connections and things of this nature that you can, might help you appreciate it a little more. And we'll make a few comments along the way. Okay? So here is the Jonah 1, verses 1 and 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. So I want you to notice as you're looking at this, you can see kind of how I've arranged this. Out of my distress is sort of parallel to out of the belly of Sheol. Sheol was a reference to the pit, the grave, that for him, imminent death. He cries out and he's heard. One of the debates with this psalm of Jonah's Psalm of Thanksgiving is whether he is describing his experience from inside the fish or his experience of being engulfed by the sea only to later, within relatively short time, be rescued by being consumed by the fish. I lean more towards the second explanation. The interesting thing is the fish is never explicitly mentioned in the psalm itself. So here I picture Jonah, he's been thrown overboard. He thinks that he's going to drown, and he's distressed about it. He's distraught. And so he prays to God. And as he recounts here, God hears his voice. And then notice verse 3, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas. That's kind of an interesting statement there, because back in chapter 1, we see the sailors, his shipmates, right, his pagan shipmates, throwing him, hurling him into the sea. And the text here is saying they were just sort of instruments, that it was ultimately God who hurled him into the sea by bringing about this tempest, this tumultuous situation. And all of this was ultimately to get Jonah in a position to humble himself and to ultimately see the error of his ways. Notice the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. I picture Jonah, just being tossed around in the ocean in the middle of nowhere. And verse 4, then I said, I'm driven from your sight, yet I shall look upon your holy temple. So Jonah, I think with verse 4, is acknowledging that, hey, he's the one that's done this to me. He has a purpose for this, that God is disciplining him in some way. Someone has said or observed that there are times when we must be made to go into the lowest depths that we may regain a living faith. Affliction, hardship, difficulty. It can be a nudge toward a deeper level of spirituality if one is wise enough to recognize it. And it seems in this psalm, again, Jonah's being cast in this psalm of his in chapter 2 in a fairly favorable light. And he even has an expression of hope here at the end. Yet I shall look upon your holy temple. And the temple represents the presence of God. And so you would, like, I think of Daniel praying towards toward Jerusalem. And you'll see that theme come up again. All right, so let's go to the next one, 5 and 6. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds, some translation have seaweeds, were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. So I picture Jonah sinking in the water. He is just headed towards the bottom, ultimately toward his demise. The text says, though, yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And it's hard not to picture the fish swooping in. This is after Jonah realizes that this fish is a vessel of salvation, and he is explaining it in these terms. Then, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, notice, into your holy temple. And then it's sort of an aside here in verse 8. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake the hope of steadfast love. So we have, from the sea's deep abyss, Jonah's prayer ascends to the throne, or to God's holy temple. And those, he says here, who rely, on idols, worthless, empty idols, they do so at a great price. Because lifeless idols rescue no one. Jonah, he's like, the Lord has saved me. The Lord has been gracious toward me. He's been merciful towards me. I could have died, but he heard my prayer, and he pointed this fish to save me. And he reflects on those who don't worship his God, a God who is capable of saving his people. And so those that look to something or someone other than God, they're cutting themselves off from any sort of true hope, salvation, or rescue. And so Jonah praises God, but with the voice of thanksgiving probably says, will I sacrifice to you? What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. It's very common at the end of a Thanksgiving psalm. You'll see this in the Psalms, is, this vow to sacrifice, a vow to pay what has been promised. The thought is, that while in the throes of despair, you're crying out to God, God, if you'll save me, I vow to do such and such. And so he is saying, I am going to make good on what I have vowed. And again, the chapter here has Jonah praising God for his merciful rescue. And he explicitly states at the end here, the very end of verse 9, salvation belongs to the Lord. Now this chapter shows Jonah, as I mentioned earlier, in a favorable light. The prophet who was trying to run from God in chapter 1 is now the prophet that is running to God here in chapter 2. But a question does remain. Is this once reluctant prophet genuinely penitent? I don't think we can deny that with this episode of the fish, that God was able to win a victory over Jonah's disposition. I do think we see in chapter 2 a change in Jonah. But we're going to note come chapter 4 that there was still some work to do on Jonah's heart. So I think we have to like what we see here. Jonah's response to this. He doesn't become hardened or angry and shake his fist at God. He is, I think, definitely a disposition of gratitude, thankfulness. You could say penitence, right? But I do want you to file that statement he makes. Salvation belongs to the Lord. In fact, that is a quote from Psalm 3:8 and Psalm 37:39. Same words appear there. And just let that sit with you the next couple of weeks. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Jonah is certainly thankful for his salvation, this physical deliverance. But then you wonder, what about those Ninevites? What about the change God would like to see in them? What if they do change? How might Jonah respond to that? How should he respond to that? So there's two things we've seen so far as in terms of the four purposes of the great fish. Saved Jonah's life, provided a classroom for Jonah's spiritual education. Number three, I would argue the great fish function as a vehicle. There was a practical purpose here, function as a vehicle to transport Jonah back toward Nineveh. So Jonah jumps off in this water. Now, he was headed towards Tarshish. But I picture this great fish swooping him up, and they begin to make the journey back towards, Joppa, or back towards that area, wherever it is that he gets. Well, here's Jonah 2:10, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Now, yes, the text does not say exactly where this dry land was. We do know in chapter 3 that it's the start of chapter 3 is almost identical to the start of chapter 1. It's as if God's saying, okay, let's try this again. But I do think it makes sense to picture this fish transporting Jonah back from the way he came. And notice, too, that this fish responds better to God than Jonah did initially. The word of the Lord came to Jonah to do such and such. Jonah didn't. The Lord spoke to the fish, and the fish did what God said. So that's maybe just a little irony there. And I realize that, for those that are weak-stomached, this is not the prettiest thing. But it might be something that might have helped Jonah in his, in his preaching to the people, and we'll discuss some possibilities next Sunday night. All right, here's the fourth, and this is where we'll come kind of full circle to Jonah 1:17. Jonah and the great fish served as a sign. So, several years later, we might put it in terms of centuries, Jesus has come on the scene. Pharisees question him on various occasions. And notice what happens in this exchange in Matthew 12:38 through 40. And some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Now, had he stopped there, we might have been left to wonder, what exactly did Jesus mean by the sign of the prophet Jonah? Fortunately, the text goes on and explains it for us. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. What's fascinating to me about these verses is, on one hand, if there was ever a story in the Bible that a skeptic, an unbeliever, or somebody might point to say, guys, I can't believe you trust in that book. I mean, you got a story of a man being swallowed by a fish and getting... That just sounds like fable. That sounds like legendary kind of stuff. I mean, did you really think that happened? Well, our faith rests on Jesus. It rests on his death, burial, and resurrection. And I find it interesting that here, Jesus verifies the historical nature of the story of Jonah and the great fish. In other words, you can't have Jesus without Jonah. You can't. And more importantly, Jonah and the great fish, they, as Jesus says here, they foreshadow the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, in Jesus' case, it was to save the world, not the life of just one man. So the fish, that great fish, served four purposes. It saved Jonah's life. It provided a schoolroom, as it were, a little spiritual education. It served as a vehicle. I believe this, to transport Jonah back towards Nineveh, where God ultimately wanted him to go and to preach. And then it served as a sign, an incredible sign, a very important sign of something that would happen in the life of Jesus towards the end there. That is the basis, the ground, the source of your salvation and my salvation. I hope that our study of Jonah 2 has been profitable and interesting to a certain extent, giving you some things to consider about this story, certainly to build your faith in the historicity of this story in light of Jesus' use of it. And I'm hopefully, let me look at my time here. Look at that, guys. I cut a lot of time off. We've been going like 45 minutes to an hour. We're down to about 30 minutes here. So I think that's good. And we'll have another lesson on Jonah 3 next week. Probably be about this long or less. And then we'll close up with Jonah 4, which is just an amazing chapter. There's a lot of really good stuff to think about in Jonah chapter 4. And we'll get there. We're going to need chapter 3, though, before we go to 4. So thanks for watching, and may God bless you this week.